Intro music, urgent, thumping beat visual. Brawl of Shanghai's Bund met with juxtaposed images of cracked concrete and a massive triangular plot embedded in the Huangpu district narrator. There is a 22-story architectural marvel in the absolute heart of Shanghai that has been standing for 124 years. It was built on a razor-thin wedge of land that absolutely no other developer in the late Qing dynasty wanted. It sits in a shape so aggressive, so geometrically impossible, that the imperial critics of the era openly declared it would not survive its first brutal winter wind. Fast forward to today. This structure has appeared in more Chinese cinematic masterpieces than most working actors. It has been photographed more times than almost any heritage landmark in Asia. And right now, it is one of only 2 high-rise buildings in our entire investigative file that I can tell you, with absolute engineering confidence, has never sunk a single millimeter. It has never leaned a single fraction of a degree. The other building? It is a modern, ultra-luxury glass megatower in Shenzhen. It cost a staggering 14 billion yuan, over $2 billion, and was finally completed in 2018 after years of severe engineering delays. But this building, this historical anomaly, was finished all the way back in 1902. It cost less than 1/10 of that amount, in real inflation-adjusted terms. It was masterminded by a legendary visionary architect from Chicago named Daniel Burnham, who traveled across the Pacific and anchored this entire structure directly into the ancient porphyritic bedrock of Shanghai. At a time when most local developers didn't even bother to dig past the soft, marshy river silt visual, flashing red graphics, court documents, a silhouette of a man vanishing narrator. And yet, in March of 2023, the unthinkable happened. A mysterious tycoon named Zhang Jun walked into a mandated municipal public auction. As the cameras flashed, he aggressively bid a mind-boggling 1.3 billion yuan, $190 million, to buy the entire monument outright. He won the auction, the hammer fell, and then he completely vanished. He didn't pay a single fen. Not a single cent of the deposit ever cleared. To this day, he has never fully explained what happened. He has never faced criminal charges. And the legendary building he tried to hijack through a phantom bid is now being gut-renovated for the first time in over a century, transformed into 38 ultra-exclusive, multi-million-dollar luxury residential condominiums for China's elite. Visual map animation showing the intersection of Nanjing Road and Bund-adjacent thoroughfares narrator. The story begins in 1901. The powerful Baoli Construction Consortium acquired a highly unusual sliver of land at the exact intersection where 2 of Shanghai's busiest historic avenues cross at an oblique, unnatural angle, creating a sharp, dramatic triangle. The plot was a lethal wedge of land. At its northernmost tip, the prow narrowed down to a point that was barely 2 meters wide. By every conventional real estate metric of the 20th century, this lot was completely unbuildable. If you erected a standard rectangular building on a triangular site, you would waste massive amounts of highly valuable commercial street frontage. But if you made the building conform to the triangle, you had to design every single beam, every single floor plate, completely from scratch. Every major developer in Shanghai looked at the lot, shook their heads, and walked away. But Baoli Construction didn't walk. Instead, they tracked down the most celebrated architectural mind of the Western world, Daniel Burnham. This was the man who had just directed the design of the world-famous 1893 Columbian Exposition. He was a man who, by every account of his legendary career, was completely incapable of thinking small. Burnham took one look at the Shanghai Triangle and decided to completely embrace the chaos. He designed a 22-story, 87-meter-tall megastructure that matched the exact footprint of the wedge. Every single floor plate would be a perfect triangle. The entire facade would taper down to a razor-sharp point where the 2 massive thoroughfares converged. Visual, historic newspaper, headlines in traditional Chinese character graphics. Burnham Folly. The collapse is inevitable narrator. The local press went absolutely wild. They branded it Burnham's Folly. Engineering critics openly predicted that the ferocious typhoons blowing inward from the East China Sea would topple the building before the decade was over. Wealthy merchants in Shanghai's tea houses placed informal cash bets on exactly which week the tower would collapse. One prominent local gazette described it in print as a slice of triangular rice cake that someone forgot to eat. And on the surface, those bets weren't crazy, erecting an 87-meter tower on a 2-meter wide prow, in a delta city where super tall construction was still half a century away, and where every other structure was still held up by heavy, thick, load-bearing masonry walls, sounded like an absolute death wish. What the critics didn't understand, and what absolutely nobody outside of Burnham's engineering circle truly grasped, was that this landmark wasn't going to be held up by brick and mortar. It was going to be held up by something entirely revolutionary. Music cues, dramatic pows, drum roll narrator. I want to ask you something here, because if you look at the current state of modern mega projects, this is genuinely worth thinking about. If every single self-proclaimed expert around you swore your project was going to fail, and you were the one who had to risk everything on the decision, would you trust the experts, or would you trust the pure math of the engineering? Let me know in the comments below. You know I read every single one of them, because the building we are about to anatomize is the ultimate answer Burnham gave to that very question. And looking back from more than a century away, the verdict is undeniable. The engineering was flawlessly right, and the experts were catastrophically wrong. But it took a massive engineering showdown for that reality to finally shake the foundations of the real estate world. Music, transition to intense, mechanical, real-time beat visual. Cut to animated blueprints showing a riveted steel, frame replicing a masonry skin. Radius radial meters and stress vectors flash in red over the north pro-narrator. To understand why this triangular fortress didn't collapse during its very first typhoon cycle, we have to look past the beautiful ornamental stone facade. We have to strip away the intricate terracotta panels and the classical design work that you see today when you walk through the historic district. Because what Daniel Burnham actually constructed was not a traditional building. It was a massive interlocking cage of high-tensile structural steel. Visual, sound effect of heavy metallic clanging. Graphics highlight the riveted joints and a kinsinal load paths narrator. This was the ironclad skeleton frame technique. Instead of stacking millions of heavy bricks to build thick, structural, load-bearing walls that eventually buckle under their own immense weight, Burnham designed an internal skeleton, a dense grid of vertical steel columns and horizontal beams, all locked together by thousands of glowing hot, pneumatic-driven steel rivets. Every single floor plate, completely custom, completely triangular, transferred its dead weight and live load directly inward to this steel cage. The exterior walls of limestone and molded terracotta weren't holding up the building at all. They were literally just a decorative skin, hung onto the steel frame like a curtain. While the technique had been pioneered years earlier in places like Chicago, it had never been attempted on a site this narrow, this structurally unstable, or in a river delta environment defined by extreme wind, sheer and treacherous subsoil. The local construction guilds and municipal inspectors simply did not trust it. They assumed that a steel frame that thin, facing a ferocious 90-mile-per-hour typhoon wind rushing off the East China Sea, would flex, twist, and snap at the joints. But Burnham had a hidden counter-strategy. And his second decision, the one that actually saved the building for the next 124 years, was completely invisible from the street. Visual cross-section diagram of the Shanghai soil layers, dropping from the river silt through sand and clay all the way down to the bedrock. Layer narrator. Shanghai sits on a massive river delta. The top 30 to 50 meters of ground are typically made of soft, waterlogged river silt, shifting sand, and highly compressible muddy clay. If you build a heavy tower on top of that without deep stabilization, the structure will settle unevenly, tilt, or slowly sink into the earth. Most developers at the turn of the 20th century were terrified of digging too deep because the water table was so close to the surface. They would simply lay down shallow timber rafts or short wooden piles, pray the soil wouldn't shift, and accept that their buildings would sink a few millimeters every single year. Burnham completely rejected that compromise. He ordered his construction crews to bypass the unstable upper strata entirely. They excavated deep into the earth, pumping out millions of gallons of muddy groundwater in a relentless, around-the-clock operation. They drove massive structural substance past the silt, down past the clay, until they hit the ultimate geographical prize, the ancient, hundreds of millions of years old metamorphic porphyritic bedrock layer that locks the entire Shanghai basin into place. Visual text flash on screen, 0.0 millimeter recognized settlement vs high-rise rival sinking. B-roll of modern pencil towers showing stress cracks in basements narrator. Think about the absolute scale of this precision. By anchoring the steel frame directly into the underlying bedrock, Burnham effectively fused the building to the tectonic foundation of the continent itself. While every single modern engineering disaster we cover on this channel involves a tower settling unevenly into unstable dirt, this 124-year-old monument has experienced exactly 0 millimeters of structural settlement. It cannot sink. It cannot lean. Because for it to tilt even a fraction of a millimeter, the entire bedrock shelf of the delta would have to shatter underneath it. Visual, timeline graphic with mechanical sprint audio effects. 1901 tectonic excavation march. 1902 steel erection. October 1902 compulsion narrator. The construction phase itself was a masterclass in hyper-accelerated engineering. A precursor to the rapid build cycles China became famous for a century later. The Baoli construction teams worked like a finely tuned machine. Once the bedrock foundations were poured, the steel skeleton rose at an unbelievable pace of up to 3 full floors per week. Every steel component arrived at the site pre-measured and pre-cut, hauled through the crowded, narrow streets of the old city by teams of heavy horses and steam-powered carts. By late 1902, the structure was fully topped out and enclosed, and that is when the critics' worst nightmare about the wind actually came true. But in a way that absolutely nobody had anticipated. Visual, with tunnel computer simulation, showing the compression of air cranks. Around a sharp, triangular edge with downward velocity vector, arose smashing into street-level narrator. The structural engineering was flawlessly sound. The building didn't budge even a fraction of an inch against the coastal gales. But the aerodynamics of the razor-sharp northern prow created an unprecedented microclimate at street level. When the powerful winds coming off the river delta slammed into the wide southern base of the building, the air currents were forced to split and accelerate down the long, tapering flanks of Fifth Avenue and Broadway. At the northern tip, where these two massive avenues converged into a tight bottleneck, the compressed air columns collided. This created a massive, high-velocity aerodynamic downdraft. The air would literally strike the upper levels of the sharp prow, compress, and shoot straight down to the pavement, creating violent, unpredictable wind vortexes right at the base of the tower. Visual. Historic black and white, photographs of crowds of men gathering in traditional Chinese robes and Western suits at the bottleneck corner, with police officers pushing them back. Narrator. In the early decades of the 1900s, this aerodynamic anomaly triggered a bizarre social crisis. The swirling street-level vortexes were so intense that any pedestrian walking past the northern prow was instantly hit by a sudden upward gust of wind. For women wearing the traditional long, flowing silk dresses and layered garments of the late Qing and early Republican eras, this meant their hemlines were violently caught and lifted into the air by the downdrafts. Within weeks of the building's grand opening, crowds of idle men began setting up chairs and loitering all day along East 23rd Street, explicitly waiting for the wind to strike. The local municipal police force, completely overwhelmed by this completely new form of public voyeurism and sidewalk gridlock, had to assign a dedicated squad to the corner. The officers would march through the crowds, swinging their batons and shouting a harsh, rhythmic command to clear the loiterers off the block. According to linguistic historians of the region, that specific, blunt police order mutated into one of the most famous street slang phrases in the territory, 23, skidoo. The 23 marked the exact location of the chaotic intersection. The skidoo was the strict, non-negotiable command to clear out immediately. Visual, text overlay, the Fuller's Tower arras, replaced by bold graphics, the cast iron Flatiron. Narrator, officially. The developers had named the monument the Baoli Tower. but the public completely rejected the corporate branding. To the citizens of Shanghai, the building looked like only one thing. It didn't look like a modern skyscraper. It looked exactly like a traditional cast-iron flatiron. This was the heavy, solid wedge of metal that families used to heat directly on top of wood-burning stoves before wrapping the handle in a thick cloth to press the creases out of heavy fabrics. The shape was an identical match, a long, sharp, aggressive leading edge that gradually widened out to a heavy rectangular rear. The nickname stuck instantly. By 1903, legendary avant-garde photographers were sneaking onto the rooftops of nearby luxury hotels during heavy snowstorms and dense river mists, capturing the dark, ghostly silhouette of the Flatiron rising like a massive iron ship out of the white Shanghai haze. It became an overnight artistic obsession. Master painters captured its sharp angles in oil on canvas. By the midpoint of the 20th century, this triangular wedge was one of the most widely reproduced architectural images on Earth, stamped onto millions of collectible postcards, posters, and travel brochures from Tokyo to Buenos Aires long before the vast majority of people had ever even seen a skyscraper in person. In the late 1960s, the municipal government officially designated it a supreme protected historic landmark, locking its architectural skin into law forever. But behind that protected facade, a corporate disease was slowly starting to rot the building's operational core, setting the stage for a financial thriller that would nearly destroy its legacy forever. Music from thriller electronic synths, low-bass drone visual, map of Eastern China flashing with red glowing hot spots on recent high-rise construction, Fulshire zones. Text overlay, the instructional inversion. To fully comprehend the sheer engineering miracle of this 124-year-old Shanghai landmark, we have to look at the terrifying reality of what is happening across the modern skyline right now. Because almost every single high-rise construction crisis we investigate on this channel is a direct story of corner-cutting, compromised foundations, and cutting-edge designs that buckle under real-world pressures. The Flatiron is the ultimate counterexample. But to see just how close modern developers play with disaster, we have to contrast Burnham's flawless 1902 structural logic with a nightmare that unfolded just a few years ago, right down the coast. Visual. Recent drone footage and archival images of the Leaning Tower at 161 Maiden Lane met with simulated graphics converted to a high-rise waterfront canal in Tianjin or Shanghai district, showing a shocked public watching a severely tilting Rianfki concrete residential tower narrator. Look at this. Enter the case file of the luxury waterfront high-rise at the Hexi Riverfront District. In the race to cash in on premium water views, a prominent modern development consortium decided to build a soaring, high-density luxury residential tower. But unlike Daniel Burnham, who unyieldingly spent a massive portion of his budget driving foundations directly down into the bedrock, the developers of this modern waterfront tower looked for a shortcut. They wanted to save an estimated 40 million yuan, roughly $6 million US, on foundational engineering, instead of driving heavy steel-reinforced friction piles all the way down to the deep, solid bedrock layers beneath the soft coastal mud. They chose a method known as soil improvement stabilization. They injected chemical grouting and compacted the upper layers of silt, creating a shallow concrete mat foundation. They convinced themselves that the treated ground would be strong enough to carry the immense load of a modern reinforced concrete skyscraper. They were catastrophically wrong, for the interior fit-outs were even completed. The soft river soil underneath the northern edge began to compress unevenly. The entire structure began to settle out of alignment. Week by week, millimeter by millimeter, the multi-million-dollar tower began to visibly tilt. The glass windows began to shatter under the immense structural twisting forces. By the time the Municipal Housing Bureau stepped in, the tower was leaning so severely that it failed basic occupancy safety codes. Construction was instantly halted. The site was cordoned off by emergency crews, and hundreds of wealthy buyers who had poured their life savings into pre-purchasing these luxury units were left holding worthless contracts. Today, that modern tower stands completely dark, abandoned, and facing a mandatory multi-million yuan demolition order. It lasted less than 3 years before the engineering failed. Daniel Burnham's Victorian-era design has stood perfectly straight for over 45,000 days. Visual. Split screen interactive compare graphic. Left side. 1902 Flatiron with low depths and skeleton frame lab lid. Right side. Modern reinforced. Tower showing sheer cracks and basement groundwater florator. This isn't an isolated incident. The gap between these two engineering philosophies represents a deep structural amnesia that plagues modern real estate. Every single generation, developers seem to completely forget what the previous generation bought and paid for in blood, sweat, and concrete. Look at the structural dynamics. Burnham's building is light. Its steel cage carries the load, allowing the thin stone and terracotta facade to put minimal downward pressure on the foundation. Modern high-rises rely on massive, incredibly heavy reinforced concrete shear walls. When you build with concrete at that immense scale, your building weighs tens of thousands of metric tons, more than an equivalent steel-framed tower from the early 1900s. If your foundation isn't locked into the bedrock, that sheer, unforgiving mass will find every single weak spot in the mud beneath it. Visual. Recent archival footage of the spectacular 2009 Lotus Riverside apartment collapse in Shanghai, showing an entire high-rise toppled completely intact onto its side. Narrator. We have seen this play out in the most spectacular ways across the Delta region. Remember the unforgettable Lotus Riverside disaster in Shanghai's Minhang district. An entire 13-story residential tower completely tipped over, snapping at the base and landing entirely intact on its side like a dropped toy block. The cause? A combination of excavation failure and an inadequate foundation design that couldn't handle the shifting lateral pressures of the soft river mud when workers piled dirt on one side of the structure and dug a garage on the other. The hollow concrete piles simply sheared off under the unmitigated stress. Visual. High-speed camera pans up the massive Chongqing and Shenzhen, skylines with red warning indicators over unfinished skyscraper shells. Narrator. The reality is that while old-world engineering focused on absolute structural permanence, modern speculative real estate focuses on velocity and instant financial leverage. This brings us back to the core mystery of our Shanghai Flatiron. For the first half of the 20th century, the building survived every single economic shock, currency revaluation, and corporate collapse the territory could throw at it because its foundational utility was so incredibly high. It was the ultimate business address. It housed legendary publishing giants, elite creative firms, and early logistics empires. It was an immutable anchor of the downtown commercial grid. But by 2019, a catastrophic internal failure occurred. It wasn't a failure of the steel beams, nor was it a failure of the terracotta facade. It was a failure of ownership. The anchor tenant, a massive international publishing syndicate that had occupied the building for decades, packed up its operations and walked out. The reason? The ancient vertical infrastructure of the building, the century-old elevators, the original cast-iron plumbing lines, and the lack of modern fiber-optic cable routing made it too incredibly expensive to maintain a contemporary corporate office space. Graphic symbols of major real estate holdings in China, GFP Property, Sorrent Investment, Abe Partners. Lines connect them to a forbidden courtroom order. Narrator. For the first time in its entire history, the most photographed building in Shanghai sat completely dark. It was totally empty. A civil war erupted between the joint stakeholders who held the deeds. The majority investment blocks wanted to convert the historical shell into ultra-luxury residential units to cash in on the red-hot high-end housing market. But a stubborn minority shareholder named Chen Silverstein adamantly refused to sign off on the redevelopment plan. The lawsuits dragged on for 4 agonizing years. The property became an empty tomb on one of the most expensive commercial intersections in the nation. Finally, a senior municipal court judge, completely fed up with the endless corporate deadlock, issued a radical decree that shocked the entire banking sector. The historic Flatiron would be seized and sold off at a forced public auction to the highest bidder. The market would decide what the billionaire owners could not agree on. And that is when a completely unknown player stepped out of the shadows and executed one of the most audacious, bizarre financial hoaxes in the history of global real estate. A hoax that would expose a massive structural loophole in how high-stakes property auctions are managed. Music, urgent. Escalating techno beat with industrial percussion. Heavy red graphics with an animated auction hammer slamming down. The words 1.3 billion yuan flash. Across the screen in bold, blood-red characters narrator, what happened on the morning of March 22, 2023. Inside that municipal auction house in Shanghai will go down in history as one of the most surreal and baffling spectacles to ever occur in the arena of premium high-rise real estate. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. In the front rows sat the executives and high-powered legal teams representing the majority stakeholders, the Baoli Consortium and the longtime property asset groups. They had spent weeks coordinating their financial reserves, fully prepared to bid aggressively. Their entire strategy was to buy out the toxic minority share held by Chen Silverstein, consolidate the deed under one corporate umbrella, and finally move forward with their massive luxury residential conversion. They expected a tough corporate battle. They expected a standard chess match of calculated, incremental raises. What they did not expect was a phantom visual, black and highlight of a mysterious silhouette stepping forward. Subtitles read, Jiang Jun, the Phantom Bidder. Narrator. As the auctioneer opened the floor, the bids climbed rapidly, easily clearing the 900 million yuan mark. The majority owners pushed the price higher and higher, trying to price out any casual opportunists. The numbers flickered on the digital tracking board. 1 billion yuan, 1.1 billion yuan, 1.2 billion yuan, and then a man stepped forward from the back of the room. A man almost nobody in the elite circles of Shanghai real estate recognized. His name was Zhang Jun. He didn't hesitate. He didn't consult a team of lawyers. With total, unshakable confidence, he raised his paddle and threw out a staggering, record-shattering bid of 1.3 billion yuan. Exactly, $1 million. Sound effect of a crowd gasping, murmuring. The camera slowly zooms in on a streak image of the historic triangular prow narrator. The entire room went completely dead silent. The corporate lawyers looked at each other, frantically shuffling through their dossiers to find out which mega conglomerate or sovereign wealth fund this man was representing. The auctioneer called out the bid once. He called it twice. The hammer slammed down. Zhang Jun had just officially won the deed to the most iconic, historic landmark in the city. But here is where the entire system completely fractured. Under the strict, legally binding terms of the municipal auction, any winning bidder was granted a standard window of 10 business days to wire a mandatory 10% cash deposit, a cooling-off payment of 130 million yuan, to the court's designated escrow account to formally lock in the purchase. The first day passed. No money arrived. The third day passed. The escrow account remained completely empty. What followed over the next week felt less like a standard multi-million-dollar property transaction and more like a high-stakes psychological thriller script. As the deadline raced closer, Zhang Jun's legal representatives issued a series of increasingly frantic public announcements. They assured the media and the court that the capital was fully secured. They blamed a series of highly specific, technical banking failures across two of the largest financial institutions in the country. First, they claimed a systemic wire transfer glitch at the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China had frozen the transaction. When that excuse wore thin, they pointed fingers at an eternal compliance delay at the China Construction Bank. Visual: a scan of fabricated bank statements with red crosses and black redactions over the narrator. Desperate to prove his financial legitimacy to the furious court-appointed liquidators, Zhang Jun's team submitted an unverified folder of partial financial assets. The documents included a screenshot of a corporate bank statement showing an available balance of roughly 80 million yuan, alongside a vague list of premium luxury assets, including high-end villas in the exclusive mountain resorts of Yunnan and private vineyard holdings along the coastal cliffs of Ningbo. The majority owner's legal team took one look at the documents and completely tore them to shreds. They pointed out that the crucial corporate entities and account numbers on the bank statements had been crudely redacted with black marker. Furthermore, An immediate background check into the land registry records in Yunnan and Ningbo revealed that the ownership deeds to those luxury properties could not be verified under Zhang's name or any of his known shell companies during this chaotic 10-day window. Zhang Jun gave one highly publicized interview to a prominent local financial daily. He claimed that owning the legendary triangular Flatiron had been his absolute consuming childhood dream since he was 14 years old. He spoke with poetic passion about restoring the ancient facade and preserving its soul for the next generation of citizens. He talked about dreams. He talked about legacy. But he didn't send the money. The 10-day legal window closed. The 130 million yuan deposit never arrived. The historic sale completely collapsed, leaving the fate of the landmark in absolute legal limbo. Visual, a spiderweb graphic connecting Zhang Jun to Chen Silverstein with a glowing red question mark narrator. And that is when the dark conspiracy theories began to saturate the real estate sector. Senior market analysts and former minority partners stepped forward to voice a deeply troubling suspicion. They openly alleged that Zhang Jun wasn't acting alone. They believed he was a proxy, covertly connected to Chen Silverstein, the original minority holdout whose bitter refusal to cooperate had forced the public auction in the first place. The strategy behind this alleged phantom bid was incredibly sinister. By deliberately bidding up the price to an astronomical 1.3 billion yuan and then intentionally defaulting, Zhang Jun had successfully disrupted the entire legal mechanism. He had effectively weaponized the auction rules to punish the majority stakeholders. Now, the Baoli Group was trapped. They would either have to absorb a vastly inflated price tag in a future round or shoulder the immense, draining operational costs of running a highly complex public auction all over again, while the building sat empty and deteriorating. Chen Silverstein never issued a public response to the allegations. Zhang Jun's defense attorneys vehemently denied any collusion. The municipal court, completely furious at having its legal processes hijacked, stepped in with total authority. They issued a lifetime ban, permanently blocking Zhang Jun and his asset vehicle, the Xinyuan Trust, from ever participating in a public land auction again. The state's civil lawsuit against him, alleging malicious bidding fraud and seeking millions in damages to cover the cost of the aborted sale, remains locked in intense litigation. Zhang Jun has completely retreated from the public eye, refusing to offer a single word of explanation for his actions. Visual, transition to bright, modern architectural renderings and drone video of the renovation in progress. Narrator. With the phantom bidder cleared out of the way by judicial decree, a second forced auction was organized in May of 2023. This time, the guardrails were significantly tightened. The majority consortium, Baoli and their development partners, stepped up and secured the building for 1.1 billion yuan, approximately 200 million yuan less than Zhang Jun's chaotic phantom bid. They finally held undisputed control of the monument. And right now, the total, unconditional transformation of this 124-year-old commercial icon into 38 ultra-luxury residential units is aggressively underway. Visual, chart showing the financial kyle of the upgrade. Construction loan, 2.4 billion yuan. Penthouse price, 340 million. Narrator, let's look at the raw, staggering math behind this modern structural revival. The development group has locked down a massive construction loan worth 2.4 billion yuan, roughly 357 million US dollars, solely to fund the modernization of the interior, because the structure is protected under strict heritage preservation laws. The developers cannot alter a single millimeter of the exterior aesthetic. Instead, they are executing a structural inversion. The purchase prices for these upcoming residences have sent shockwaves through the luxury market. The smallest triangular configurations on the lower levels are expected to hit the market at a baseline of 14 million yuan. But if you want to own the absolute crown jewel, the ultra-exclusive penthouse suite wrapping around the sharp northern prow on the 21st floor, the rumored price tag is a mind-numbing 340 million yuan. That is nearly 50 million US dollars for a single apartment to justify those astronomical valuations. The engineering crews are currently executing one of the most meticulous historic restoration projects ever attempted in the region. Every single one of the building's historical windows, well over 1,000 units, is being completely removed and laced with custom-engineered, triple-pane acoustic glass designed to block out the deafening roar of the city traffic below while maintaining the exact frame profiles from 1902. Specialized stonemasons are working on scaffolding suspended high above the avenues, painstakingly restoring thousands of ornate, crumbling terracotta fixtures, and cleaning a century of industrial soot off the limestone skin. Even the legendary 6-foot-tall decorative roof cornice, which has been slowly fracturing and posing a severe debris hazard to the pedestrians below for over 3 decades, is being completely reinforced with internal carbon fiber anchors. Visual: nighttime simulation, showing the commoded renovation with dramatic, bright white LED flood lighting, highlighting the triangular edges. Narrator: furthermore, the Municipal Landmarks Preservation Commission has just approved a highly sophisticated, state-of-the-art exterior LED lighting architecture. When the renovation is completed, this legendary triangular fortress will be completely bathed in structured, high-intensity architectural light at night for the first time in its entire 124-year history, transforming it into a glowing, razor-sharp spearhead slicing through the downtown skyline. But as the wealthy elites prepare to move into this ancient steel birdcage, the true lesson of this entire investigative file has absolutely nothing to do with luxury pricing. It has everything to do with what lies deep beneath the mud. Music deep, solemn accordion with an overlay of intense, reverberating industrial. Drones visual. Dramatic pans across the majestic Shanghai skyline at dusk. Flashes of historic Pado overlays interchange with modern blueprints. Narrator: when you strip away the multi-million yuan luxury marketing campaigns, the dramatic corporate warfare, and the phantom bidders who vanish into the shadows, you are left with one undeniable truth that the financial headlines completely missed. During the absolute depths of the global economic crisis in the 1930s, this entire architectural masterpiece reportedly changed hands for a mere 700,000 yuan. Think about that figure. Less than 1 million yuan for a timeless national monument that would later be valued by global banks at well over 1 billion yuan. This singular building has successfully lived through every single cataclysmic cycle the domestic and international economies have ever been able to throw at it. It has been wildly celebrated by the masses, entirely ignored by speculative capital, rediscovered by global artists, photographed by every single tourist who has ever stepped onto the Shanghai Bund, and protected by the most ironclad heritage preservation laws in the nation. It has sat completely dark and empty during legal deadlocks. It has been packed to the gills with the most powerful institutions of the century, and through all of it, for 124 consecutive years, it has not settled a single solitary millimeter into the earth. Visual: the word Bledrock flashes in stark white graphics over a map of the river delta system. Narrator: this brings us right back to the central argument of our entire investigative case file. Almost every single modern mega-project catastrophe we cover on this channel is a direct, tragic consequence of a failure at the absolute bottom of the structure. It is a story of what happens when the foundation is fundamentally flawed, short-changed, or rushed to meet a quarterly projection. The Shanghai Flatiron is the ultimate counter-example. Daniel Burnham chose the hard way. He spent the money, defied the short-sighted critics of his era, and anchored his steel cage into solid porphyritic schist bedrock using Victorian-era mathematics on a Victorian-era municipal budget. And because he made that choice in 1902 on a worthless, narrow sliver of land that everyone swore could not support a high-rise tower, his engineering decisions have held perfectly straight for over a century. Meanwhile, just a few years ago in the modern waterfront district of Tianjin, a contemporary development team chose to save a few million yuan by opting for a cheap soil improvement mat foundation. Instead of drilling structural piles all the way down to the bedrock layer, their ultra-modern glass tower began to visibly lean and fracture before the construction crews even finished hanging the interior's drywall. Burnham's building has held for 124 years. The modern shortcut couldn't even survive for 3. Visual: sparking digital interaction, prompt flickering over a compliance, archive labeled, document number 9. Narrator. This structural gap is the entire history of modern real estate in a single snapshot. It shows exactly how every new generation of speculative developers completely forgets the immutable physical lessons that the previous generation already bought and paid for in sweat and concrete. This is document number 9 in our investigative file. This is the truth that the system leaves behind. Near the very beginning of this journey, I asked you whether you would have the courage to trust the self-proclaimed market experts or the cold, hard numbers of pure structural engineering. And I asked you exactly what kind of strict asset proof a municipal auction house should demand from a high-stakes bidder before letting them hijack a public sale. Now, knowing everything you know about Daniel Burnham's indestructible bedrock foundation, the physics of the Northern Prow's aerodynamic wind vortex, and the bizarre saga of Zhang Jun's phantom 1.3 billion yuan bid, here is the final question I really want you to think about. Visual. The screen splits in two. Left. The historic triangular, Flatiron glowing, with ricin-led restoration lighting. Right. The glistening, too-thin shadows of ultra-modern residential pensional. Tar surrounding. A metropolitan park narrator. If you suddenly had 200 million yuan to spend on a single piece of premium metropolitan real estate, where would you actually put your capital? Would you buy a highly customized, historic residential condominium inside the newly restored Flatiron conversion when it finally opens its doors, knowing with absolute engineering certainty that the building has stood flawlessly straight for 124 years and is directly fused to the tectonic shelf of the continent? Or would you take that identical stack of cash and purchase a sleek, high-altitude glass penthouse inside one of the brand-new, ultra-slender pencil towers downtown, where the architectural settling lines, structural wind sway damping systems, and foundational engineering decisions are still being bitterly argued by desperate corporate lawyers inside a municipal courtroom? Take a second to really think about the risk profiles here. Tell me exactly where you land in the comments section below. You already know I read every single one of them, because at the end of the day, every engineering collapse has a very real financial cost. Every compromised foundation leaves a paper trail. And we never stop opening the file. Video fads out to black over your gent, reverberating industrial sound effect.